Hey, welcome to Gold's Garage. So this is the second video about installing a 427 big block where there used to be a small block. And before I get too far ahead, I want you to take one good look at this gorgeous 1966 El Camino. Belongs to my customer Dave Othwaite, and he's not here right now. Today I have Alex Vendrig, my good friend from hockey and golf, with me, helping me out, because this is going to be a two-man job. So in the previous video, I had the engine hanging on a hook, and the plan was at that time to install the engine and transmission together. And that's the conventional, normally the correct way. We took the small block out that way with no problems, and I'm sure we could put it back in with no problems. However, because it's a big block and because it has a Moroso oil pan on it, it's a racing oil pan with nice windage trays and trapdoors and all that nice stuff, and I didn't want to not use that. We had trouble getting it in. I tried to get it in together with the transmission connected to the engine and spent or wasted a lot of time trying. So if you're thinking of trying, save yourself the trouble. I had the engine tilted at such an angle that the transmission tail shaft was almost touching the floor, and it still will not fit. So the only way this thing is going to work is I split the engine and transmission. I don't like to do that for a bunch of reasons. First of all, if you're lucky enough to have a hoist and a transmission jack, putting the transmission in after is not that big of a deal. However, I don't have either one of those things. So we're faced with putting this in from underneath. The engine is in, it's on the pins, it's on the motor mounts, so it's in the right place. So here's the plan. It's big and heavy and dangerous under there. So if you can visualize, when GM built this, they were thinking about me. They put two little eyelets in the casting. So I'm going to use straps, and this is just a mock-up. When we get the camera back off, we're disconnecting this. We're going to feed these straps up between the firewall and the engine, and Alex is going to lift the front of the transmission up with my, fortunately I have a beam in my ceiling, and Alex is going to lift the transmission up at the front. I'm going to manipulate it from the back and hopefully get it on the dowels. Once we do that, we're home free. So that's the plan for today, and I'm pretty sure it's going to work. It's going to be very safe because we don't have to worry about dropping it or falling over or whatever else. Putting it on just a regular floor jack is not good practice, and I didn't want to do that. So we'll leave that for now, and we will come back to you when we have a chance to give it a try. Hey, welcome back to Gold's Garage. So in the previous first section of this video, I described how I was going to plan to install the transmission in this 66 El Camino, and since then I have done that. That's about a week ago actually, and my problem was I don't have a hoist or a transmission jack. The only way to get the engine in, I found out, with a 427, especially with a big oil pan on it, which this has, it's got a big Moroso oil pan on it, is to drop the engine straight down, so you're left with putting the transmission in from underneath. And that's always a difficult thing to do unless you have a hoist and the transmission jack. So I solved that problem. I described how I was going to do that by putting some straps up between the firewall and in the back of the engine, which was already in, using my hoist overhead, someone on the hoist upstairs. I was below, and he basically hoisted the transmission into place. In fact, it went so well, if I'd known how well it was going to go, would have had somebody here to video it, but I didn't. So it got in there pretty quick, and that's a good, safe way. You do not have to worry about it dropping on you. These transmissions are not, they're pretty heavy. And it's nice to know that it was well supported from the top, and all I had to do was kind of guide it into place. So, and even if you don't have a beam in your ceiling, if you have a cherry picker, you can use the same method to install a transmission in a car if you don't have a hoist. So obviously that was about a week ago. A lot of things have happened. This project is pretty much complete. and this El Camino had a small block in it. So I led up to this video with a couple other bites about, I was going to describe all the things that you need to do when you go from a small block to a big block. And we've overcome all those issues, and now I'm going to kind of describe them to you. So to make sure I don't forget anything, I have a list, and this list will be inserted into the video, so you don't need to worry about it. But I'm going to cover off these points as quickly as I can. If you're going to do this, planning is everything, and even though we did plan, we still ran into some stuff that delayed the job, took longer, and cost more, and that's what happens sometimes. So first thing, motor mounts weren't an issue. I took the motor mounts off the small block, bolted them on the big block, and they fit right into place. Not an issue. Rad hoses, I actually used the top and bottom rad hose from the small block. I had to cut them both an inch or two because the motor is closer than it was before, but that's the original rad hoses. Heater hose the same way. I just had to cut a couple inches off them, and that was solved very easily. The oil pan, once again, if you have a stock oil pan, I'm not sure if I would have gone in with a stock oil pan with the transmission connected or not. I did actually buy a stock oil pan, and I thought about changing the pan. I decided to try to put it in the way that I just described instead, and it worked out. This engine originally had a mechanical fan, a conventional mechanical fan, the car, when it had the small block in it, so I had to do something for cooling. So I installed two 10-inch fans behind the radiator, and I used a relay wiring, fuse relay wiring, and for that. And if you have that much power draw, you should use a relay instead of direct wiring them. And that's all done, and I've run this engine long enough to know now that's more than adequate. Cooling. Ignition distributor wires. It did have a MSD distributor before with a coil, and for a number of reasons we decided to go just with the HEI. It was simpler, and I had to make some other moves in that area where the kickdown device is coming from the transmission. Kind of ran out of real estate for the coil. Yeah, we could have mounted the coil remotely, but we decided to go with an HEI just because it was simpler. And that HEI is the same HEI that was used when I dynoed this engine, so it works fine. So that's covered off. It runs good, and they're nice and simple. You just plug in the power, 12-volt, clean power, 12-volt power supply, and you're ready to go. Radiator is the same radiator. Fortunately, the customer had a nice big 4-core radiator in it already, so we got more than adequate cooling with this radiator, once again with the fans added on. The headers, obviously, you go from a small block to a big block, you need to change the headers. In fact, the original small block had shorties on it, and these are nice Hebman long tube headers. They're beautiful headers, and they went in pretty good, actually. Wasn't too much of a problem. If you ever go to put them in yourself after the fact, you got to pull the pins on the motor mounts and lift the engine up off the mounts a few inches to get room to get the header in, and then you put it back down and put your pins back in again. They will not go in with the motor mount bolts installed. The exhaust system, hard to show it, but we actually converted the exhaust system. It had a nice 2.5-inch exhaust system back to MagnaFlow mufflers already, and we actually use sleeve clamps to convert from the 3-inch collector on the header to the 2.5-inch, and I did that without any welding or fitting, or with fitting but without any welding, and it worked really well. It does not leak and solved the problem. I do not like welding in my shop. I have a welder from the race car days, and if I have to I will, but I'd rather not do that. The throttle linkage was a problem. The original throttle linkage wasn't adequate to pull back all the way, so I had to actually see it sticking up there. I probably should have painted it or something, I guess, but I had to actually I'll use the term manufacture an extra linkage. We have wide open throttle, it works fine, and solve that, but you just can't take your old throttle linkage and stick it on the new carburetor on the big block, and it won't work. Kickdown cables, similarly. This is a 350 turbo transmission, 427. I don't think GM ever used a 350 turbo behind a 427. The kickdown cable did not reach. I was able to mount it on the manifold similarly, but I had to make a little link that extended it to reach the kickdown on the carburetor, otherwise it wouldn't work. The transmission is a 350 turbo transmission, and what we did on that, we changed the pan on it and also changed the torque converter. We put a torque converter that's 2,000 to 2,400 stall speed converter. With this engine, it probably would have been fine without that. It's kind of marginal whether it would need one. However, right now it's got a 3.08 rear axle ratio, and we thought we better do that. Dave, the owner, is looking at changing that. He has a 373, which I think he's going to put in here, which will make it a lot nicer, unless you're driving on the highway all the time. Power steering, the serpentine belt system that we bought had a power steering pump with it, so we installed a new power steering. You have to bleed the power steering if you do that. It's kind of a methodical process to make sure you don't have any error in your power steering system, and we followed the procedure and did that. There's no issues. You just saw there's a nice serpentine system. Transmission mounts and drive shaft as original. They bolt right back in where they came from, no issues at all. The oil pressure gauge on the small block is right at the back of the block. It's very handy. In this case, it's a gauge with a 1/8" copper pipe, and on the big block, it's way down on the bottom by the oil filter. So I had to extend that to make it reach. The power brake booster, as you can see, the power brake booster, the original brake booster would have been too big in diameter to work with these valve covers. Now, if we had used the stock valve covers, the original brake booster would have been okay, but even with, as you can see right there, even with the small diameter brake booster, there's not much room to get the valve cover off, but there's enough. Can't even get the last wing nut in there. That's how close it is. Now, had we not used roller rockers on the engine, we could have put the stock valve covers, would have worked. But because I use roller rockers, you need higher valve covers in order to clear the rockers, and that necessitated one thing leads to another. That's kind of the way these things go on conversions. You do one thing, it causes another problem, and then you got to solve it. That's kind of how it works. Exhaust and headers I already mentioned. The intake manifold, the original manifold, when I dynoed this engine, was a single plane manifold, and the hood clearance would not have been sufficient if I had stayed with it. So we changed to a dual plane manifold, and I used a drop down. The bottom of this breather is a drop down bottom, which lowers the breather down a little bit. And without both of those things, we are just making it. In fact, I couldn't use the wing nut on top of the breather. That's how close it is for clearance. And so we had to use a drop down base. And the only thing that, even though we planned, the thing that did go wrong, that we didn't anticipate, the serpentine system that was purchased was designed for use with aftermarket air conditioning. And as you can see, the aftermarket air conditioning is supposed to be installed right here, and there's not sufficient hood clearance for it. So that's a problem that Dave is going to solve himself later when he gets it back home in King City, Ontario. He's going to have to make another arrangement with a different type of serpentine system. The original OEM air conditioner might fit, because I think the original location is on the passenger side, not on the driver's side, but we just had to basically delete it for purposes of this install, and that's something he's going to take care of later. That's mainly the hit points. I'm going to get in and back it outside so we can have a better look at the car and hear how nice it runs. Just so you know, the exhaust exit is just in front of the rear axle, so it sounds a little different than typically if the pipe reached the back of the car. So I'm going to start it up and back it out, and let's see how it looks. sun finally come out, so we get a good look at our beautiful 66 El Camino. Ready to go. The hood fits back on nicely. Sounds cool. Runs nice. And we just gotta wait. My customer's 2.5 hours away from here, so we gotta wait for a nice enough day that he can get here and get back home without getting rained on, and we're good to go. Thanks for watching Gold Scratch. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.